Everyone, welcome to our week 2 video in week 3. So sorry about that. It's a bit late. So today we're going to be talking about 3 terms that we use quite a bit throughout the semester, all of which have to do with the way interactive digital storytelling and sometimes non-digital storytelling too occur. And those 3 terms are embedded narrative, branching narrative, and emergent narrative. So these are the 3 different ways in which interactive narrative tends to happen. First of all, there's embedded narrative, and it's pretty easy to remember. It is pre-written story that exists even before a player interacts with the story. So this is basically your set story. You can't really affect it. In video games, this kind of story is often seen as something to accompany the actual gameplay, as with a lot of single-player campaigns and multiplayer games and such. A lot of, though not all, embedded narrative is interactive only in very limited ways, at least on the storytelling end. The stories are linear and don't change between read-throughs or playthroughs. This is not true of all embedded narratives, and we'll talk about the exception next, but for the most part, most of your embedded narratives don't change even based on the user's choice. A good example of a simple embedded narrative, so one that doesn't change, would be a game like Final Fantasy X. The story will be essentially the same story every time, and any choices the player makes, while they may make a difference in strictly gameplay elements, like the strength level of the characters in battle, have almost no power to make changes in the story. No matter who you are, no matter how you play, the same things will happen in Final Fantasy X. The same characters will always join your group, the 2 main characters will always develop feelings for each other, the ending will always be the same, etc. With a simple embedded narrative, there is one story that every reader or player experiences, and the creators have a single story that they want to tell, and that they want to make sure that you experience as the audience. This is especially common in Japanese role-playing games, like Final Fantasy X, and some kinds of visual novels. We'll talk about those later, but specifically the kind called kinetic novels. But you can also often find this in the stories of fighting games, some first-person shooters, puzzle games, adventure games, and the like. Changing the story is not part of the gameplay. The story is something that kind of accompanies the gameplay and goes alongside it. If you do want interactivity in an embedded narrative, however, there is a way. Branching narrative is a subcategory of embedded narrative that allows the story to change in noticeable ways based on the user's choices. Since it is an embedded narrative, the story is still entirely pre-written, but there is a place for reader or player interaction to change the story. The power of those changes is limited, and specifically it involves essentially switching from one pre-written track to another pre-written track, but the audience's choices can still affect the story. One of the obvious examples here, of course, is game books. Choose Your Own Adventure basically has it in the name. You have a bunch of adventures and you can choose between them. But a lot of other kinds of story-based games tend to fall in this category, especially those that want to give the player some kind of control over the narrative. In branching narratives, the gameplay and the story are not essentially separate, but the ability to change the story is part of the gameplay. So there are a lot of prominent game genres that include this method of storytelling, since it is one of the most suited to the already interactive form of a video game. And there are benefits to allowing your player to change things, and we'll talk about what those are in a bit. But just as there are entirely linear role-playing games, there are role-playing games where the player's choices make a large difference on the plot. So as one example, in Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the player's character is a Jedi, who, based on the actions they take throughout the game, can be either a light side Jedi or a dark side Jedi. As you can imagine, these lead to very different stories as the game progresses, while the main story, going up against a particular dark side Jedi and the forces behind him, is the same. It depends on whether you're trying to defeat him to save the world, or whether you're trying to defeat him because he's competition. And the other characters in the game react accordingly, and you can treat them accordingly. More recently, the Mass Effect trilogy made by the same folks who made Knights of the Old Republic, carried the player's choices through 3 different games with the same character. You always control a military type turned secret agent named Shepard, but you can determine Shepard's first name, gender, appearance, and past, and the actions you have Shepard take will determine what kind of person they are and how the story changes. By the 3rd game, some Shepards will have lots of allies, while other Shepard's allies may be largely dead, either by accident or by a Shepard. And some Shepards will have opportunities based on their previous actions that others don't. As one example, late in the 1st game, one of your allies, Rex, a member of an aggressive, violent alien species called the Krogan, threatens to turn on you. Your current mission is to destroy a base that has a potential cure for a disease that is killing his species. Depending on your previous actions and the actions you choose in that scene itself, your Shepard's story and Rex's story can go quite differently. You can talk him down by telling him that this cure isn't actually a cure, just another form of enslavement, and as a result, he lives. You can talk him down by appealing to the personal friendship you've built with Rex, by helping him in the past, and again, he lives. You can try to talk him down, but fail and one of your other allies shoots him anyway, and he dies. Or you can even explicitly signal that ally to shoot him, and he dies. Or you can even shoot him yourself, and he dies. Whether Rex lives or dies has major significance for the future of his species in future games in the series, and there are dozens of choices like this in these games. The main upside of branching narrative like this is pretty obvious. It gives the reader or player some level of control over the story, and as a result it becomes more theirs. If you're the sort of person who would rather shoot Rex in the face than work things out with him, you can do that. If you're the sort of person who wants to make peace and keep him on your side and alive, you can do that too. That's something a simple embedded narrative can't really do, and it allows players to engage with their Shepards in ways they might not engage with the preset main characters of Final Fantasy X. The downside to branching narrative, of course, is equally obvious. It is a huge amount of work because every single option and all of its effects have to be pre-written, and a lot of it is for things only a fraction of your audience might see. For example, in Mass Effect, on average about 18% of players chose to play as a female Shepard, according to the creator's statistics. Only 36% of players were able to meet Rex in Mass Effect 3, since starting a new game in 3 by default assumes that he died. If there's content specifically between a female Shepard and a surviving Rex in Mass Effect 3, that means you're looking at maybe 6% of your audience seeing it, and this is content between 2 major characters in the game. Some content is seen by so few people, like less than 1%, that you end up asking the question of, is this choice worth the work and expense of writing, voice recording, programming, etc.? That's why something like with Mass Effect, with its hundreds of choices that affect the story, is rare compared to more simple branching kinds of stories, like Choose Your Own Adventure. That said, some of that simple branching can still have a pretty huge effect on the story. An example of how that can work is the strategy role-playing game, Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together. The game is divided into 4 chapters, and you play a member of a resistance group trying to stop ethnic cleansing of your small minority. At the end of the first chapter, your superiors in this resistance group order you to kill a village of your own people as a sort of false flag operation. You have the choice to obey them, in which case you remain trusted members of the resistance, but you have blood on your hands, or a choice to refuse, at which point you may feel morally better, but your former allies will attack you and try to hunt you down. Depending on the choice you make, Chapter 2 of that game is entirely different, and characters who are trusted allies in one playthrough might be enemies you have to kill in another, and vice versa. If you did choose to remain with that resistance group, the end of Chapter 2 gives you another similar choice, to stay with the group or attempt to leave, resulting in 3 different Chapters 3? Each with their own battles to fight and characters to recruit. While the plot tends to converge again for all these routes in Chapter 4, the after effects of the earlier plot are still felt. So certain things are achievable or not, depending on who was recruited or who is still alive and who was not. And that kind of brings up another issue with branching narratives. If it's part of a series, all those different choices have to come back together and end at a same or similar place to set up for any sequels. This can often limit the possibilities of branching narrative, and is a reason why players sometimes find some of these games unsatisfying. Even the final Mass Effect game came in for a lot of flack at the time for what some players felt was insufficiently taking past choices into account during its ending. So, classic examples of branching narrative beyond the ones I've already mentioned are most visual novel games, where the narrative choices the player makes often are the gameplay. A lot of role-playing games also use branching narrative, though those made in America or Europe tend to be more open to this than those made in Japan. There are exceptions, of course, such as Tactics Ogre itself. And that brings us to our other kind of narrative, emergent narrative. So, both embedded and its subcategory of branching narrative, both of those kinds of storytelling are pre-written. Like, they have a story, or a series of stories, or a series of ways to go through the same story that they want you to experience. Emergent narrative does not do that. It is not pre-written. Emergent narrative comes out of the player's interaction with the game world and its rules and systems. Story is created moment by moment by the player or players, and it will usually differ from playthrough to playthrough or from player to player, based on the actions that that player takes. So in an emergent narrative, the way players interact with the game can create stories even the creators of the game may not anticipate. In a lot of ways, emergent narratives aren't so much stories in and of themselves as they are story creation tools for their players. One of the most famous and popular examples of emergent narrative is the Sims series of games. Players can create their family of Sims, determining the way each Sim looks, as well as their personality and hobbies, or choose to play a pre-existing family. And a set of elaborate game systems works with the player's choices to create a story. For example, Sims have their own sets of motives and needs for things like hunger or fun, as well as their own relationships and interactions with other Sims. The Sims doesn't have its own story per se. However, based on the player's choices, based on those game systems like needs and relationships, every player of The Sims comes out of the game with their own unique story, in which their Sims may have fallen in love with other Sims, or died in a grease fire when they were trying to repair the stove, or been impregnated by aliens, making it kind of wild in those games. There are in fact forums devoted to nothing but players' write-ups of their Sims' soap operatic life stories. Another great example of emergent narrative is the Crusader Kings series of games, which work to simulate a medieval dynasty of rulers. You choose a historical ruler, or you create your own, and from there the game follows not history, but your own unique alternate history that takes off from that point in our real history. If you've ever wondered how the world might look different if England had never been conquered by the Norman French, or if Mongol or Turkish invasions had fully overtaken Europe in the Middle Ages, or if France had allowed women to rule in a time where they couldn't, this game offers you a chance to see what that would have been like. Again, the pre-written story is just history, and serves only as a starting point for players to create their own story using the systems of the game. It's also not restricted exclusively to the Middle Ages. Unofficial modifications of the game have allowed for the same kind of gameplay in the worlds of Game of Thrones, the Elder Scrolls games, Middle-earth, or post-apocalyptic America. Again, as with The Sims, there are entire forums out there devoted to AARs, after-action reports, documenting players' individual world histories. Emergent narrative is also how many tabletop role-playing and board games tell a story. Whether it's the stories that emerge from sheep trading in Settlers of Catan, or from bards trying to seduce orc barbarians in Dungeons and Dragons, these are games that have systems set up primarily to allow players to create their own stories, rather than experiencing the creator's own story. There is some level of crossover between these categories, in that games can have both branching narratives for some parts of their story, and emergent narratives for others. Skyrim, for example, has a fairly set plotline with a few choices that matter, such as taking sides in a civil war. almost as many stories emerge from game glitches, where the player interacting with the world in a way which the player doesn't anticipate, and which the creators of Skyrim may also not have anticipated. So, quick recap. Embedded narratives are pre-written, and often they offer no way for a reader or player to change the story in any real way. Some, however, do. Those are branching narratives, which are a kind of embedded narrative that lets readers or players change the plot through their choices, but is still ultimately telling the creator's story. Finally, there's emergent narrative, which has no set pre-written narrative, instead supplying a set of rules and systems that allows the players to create their own stories within the world of the game. So we found these three kind of distinctions interesting to hear about. Hopefully they're making you think a little about kind of how our first reading, To Be or Not To Be, is working. For the record, as I've kind of mentioned, Choose Your Own Adventures are branching narratives. And so we'll definitely be talking some, ideally, in discussion about what this kind of branching narrative does, what it doesn't do, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are. And in general, hopefully we will be returning to these a lot over the course of the semester. So if you have any questions about any of these terms, definitely feel free to, post that in discussion or message me, although discussion might be better just because other people may have the same questions and then they'll see the answer too. So I guess I will see you in our next video. Bye.